where should bad thing be? Well, it should be in that little dashed box. But since we didn't click that thing at the bottom there that said update my frame to where my constraints are, it didn't do it. So bad thing is still where it was. And that's why these are yellow. Okay, how can I know why my constraints are yellow? Well, one place is that little triangle in the upper corner there, the normal triangle where you would look at any other warning in your app. And you can see that it says the frame for bad thing will be different at runtime. That's because at runtime, the constraints are going to be applied and it's going to be moved into that little dash box. Okay, another place you can see these warnings if your constraints are yellow is in the document outline. Now, we have not had a chance to talk about the document outline in this class, but there's really not a lot to say about it except for that it's really great. And what is it? It's every single object in your storyboard that matters in an outline form. Okay, so that's all your views, all your gestures, all your constraints, things like layout guides, which we're really not going to have a chance to talk about, but it has to do with the auto layout system as well. Those are all listed in this outline, and what's really cool is you can click on them to select, because sometimes your view is very crowded and it's hard to click on the thing you want, even using the Control-Shift trick that I showed you. And also you can control drag from them. Okay, you can control drag from a gesture, you can control drag from a view. It's a really great place to control drag things from. Okay, it's pro tip number one. Control drag from document outline. The document outline also will show you all the problems with your auto layout. And you see the tiny little yellow circle up there where it says View Controller Scene at the top of the document outline, and then there's that little yellow circle. I'm going to click on that circle, and it's going to show me all the auto layout problems in this controller, in this scene. And you can see the bad thing, it expects a certain frame, and the actual frame is different. And you see the little triangle there. If I click on that triangle, it will offer to solve the problem for me. Okay? Now, how can it solve the problem? Well, there's a number of ways it could solve the problem. It could change the frame of bad thing to be what the constraints say. That's what update frame is. It could update the constraints instead of being the vertical and horizontal center that I just sent it to. It could set them back to being something that would make the bad thing's frame work. Or it could try to set it to the suggested constraints, which we already know don't work. So we definitely want update frame in this case. Okay? We know we like our constraints. That's the horizontal vertical centering. So we're going to pick that. So I'm going to leave update frame suggested and click where it says fix misplacement. And watch what's going to happen to bad thing. It moved. Okay? Now everything is no longer yellow. Bad thing's frame has been set to what the constraints demand of it. Okay? And I just hit back to go back to in the document outline. So now let's go look in landscape and see what happens to bad thing. It stays centered. Okay? Bad thing properly stays centered because the only rules it has is for it to be in the center. Okay? All right, so back to here. Okay, you can also click on, I told you could click on these constraints. So here I clicked on the vertical constraint there. You can see I just clicked on it. And you see how it's kind of highlighted. Also notice that the attribute inspector started being an inspector that's inspecting the center X alignment constraint. Okay? And there's a lot of things you can say about constraints. Notice there's a priority there because you might have two constraints in a complicated layout, only complicated ones. You might have conflicting constraints. You want something to be underneath something else, but you want it to try and be in the middle of the screen. But if the screen gets really small, then you want it to just move down out of the way of the thing on top. Those kind of conflicting constraints, you can set priorities to say which is more important. Is it more important to be in the middle, or is it more important to be underneath this other view? You see what I'm saying? So you can set your priorities between 0 and 1,000. So you get up to 1,000 items could have varying priorities. I mean, generally, you're only going to use 2 or 3 different priorities in your entire application. But anyway, the other thing you can do when you have this selected is hit delete. And that deletes that constraint. And now you can see the bad thing only has this center Y constraint. So it no longer specifies where it is horizontally. And that is really bad. And now if you look at the document outline, I not only have a little dot up there, but it's red. Okay? And if I had a constraint that was bad here, the problem is I have a lack of constraints. I don't have enough constraints to specify where bad thing is horizontally. But if I had two that conflicted, they would be red. Okay? The constraint, the lines on the screen would be red, and I would have this little red circle. So let's click on that red circle in the document outline. And here it's saying missing constraints. Okay, bad thing needs constraints for X position, it's saying, which it does. Because how else is it going to know where to put X bad thing? There's nothing that says where to put it because I took that constraint that was telling it to be in the middle away. So let's click on that red thing. And when we do, it's going to offer to fix that. And it says, let me try and add a missing constraint. And it's going to do the best it can to add a constraint or a number of constraints to make it so that at least there's not a missing constraint. This might not be the constraint you want, but it's probably going to be mostly suggested constraints, but it's going to be some kind of constraint so that so the position of this thing and its size are completely specified. So in this case, since we already blue guidelined this thing to the middle and we know it's exactly in the middle, when we hit add missing constraints, it's just going to put that thing back. Okay? Now it's not putting it back because it knows I deleted it. It's just thinking, that's the best constraint that goes here because it knows this thing is dead center. So it's like, dead center thing, I'm probably going to do that. So it's really smart about what missing constraints it will put in there. Mostly it's going to use suggested constraints, but it's even smarter than just the suggestion system. Okay, so now we have no auto layout issues. We're back to having bad thing in a good spot. Now what if I decided I don't want bad thing in the middle. I want bad thing to be stacked on top of thing 2 all the time. So I just pick up bad thing and drag it down. Well, I'll use the blue guidelines or not, but I'm just going to drag it down there and I drop it. And what happens? Well, I get the yellow guidelines again because bad thing, once again, is misplaced. That's because when you drag things to new positions, it does not change the constraints. That's important to understand. When you drag things somewhere new, the constraints stay the same. So bad things constraints are still align center X and align Y, you see? See them right there? And that's no good. So what can we do about that? Well, we probably want to delete these constraints because they no longer apply. And I showed you how to delete them by doing clear constraints. And I told you how to delete them by clicking on them and hit delete. Here's another way to delete them. You see the little cog right there where it says align center Y and align center X. There's a little cog. If you click on that, there's a little menu. You can edit it, which is exactly the same as Attributes Inspector on it. Or you can delete it. So I'll delete that one, and I'll delete that one. So now I've got rid of those constraints. Bad things back to having no constraints. I just did that. I wanted to show you that there's multiple ways to get at this thing. You can also delete them by selecting them in the document outline and hitting delete. Okay? So now I have bad thing, but where it is there, it's not tied to thing 2. If I were to go landscape right now, it would not stick with thing 2 because there's no constraint that ties it to thing 2. Okay? So let's put a constraint. Here's way number 3. Okay, do you remember what ways number 1 are? Number 1 is blue guidelines suggested constraints. That's way number 1. All right? Ever got that? Number 2 is to use the little menu things at the bottom. Click, bring up the little thing, type in, click horizontal, whatever. Click the things that you want. Way number 3 is to control drag, just like you're making an outlet, between 2 items that you want to have some sort of constrained relationship. So I'm going to control drag from bad thing to thing 2. Okay? And when I do, I get a little black box, just like if I were making an outlet. But this time it's saying, what do you want to tie between these 2 items? What do you want to be fixed between these 2? So you can actually select multiple of these using Shift. That's what it says at the bottom there. Hold Shift to select multiple. So I'm going to pick the vertical spacing. I want bad thing to always be a fixed vertical space above thing 2. And I'm also going to pick right edge. Okay? And this is saying left and right, but it's really trailing and leading. It just right now, it knows which is your left and right, so it's saying right to be nice to you. So I'm going to pick both vertical spacing and the right edges. Okay? When I do that, you can see I get 2 constraints. You can see them on screen too, the little blue lines in the I-beam between bad thing and thing 2. That is lining up the right edges and fixing the space between them to the default space. Okay, that's because I used the blue guidelines. If I hadn't used the blue guidelines and had put bad thing 40 pixels above, then it would have fixed it to 40 pixels. But we would have seen in the constraints 40, and we said, oh, magic numbers and constraints, better fix that. Okay, which you can do by editing the constraint, and just there's a button actually that says make it the default. All right. So now I have these 2 things tied in that way. Again, this is totally enough to specify all of their positions exactly, because thing 2 is tied to the corner and bad thing is tied to the right edge and just above thing 2. So if we go to landscape again, bad thing will always stay that distance and always to the right edge of thing 2. Okay? So that's way number 3 to attach things, is to control drag between them. And you can control drag between items, between views. You can also control drag from a view to its super view. That's what I'm doing here, bad thing to its super view, and you'll get a different set of options like horizontal and vertical container. Or you can also control drag to yourself. Okay? Why would you ever control drag to yourself? Well, bad thing, why would I control drag bad thing to itself? Well, then I'll get the option to do things like fix bad things with, okay? Which I told you is bad anytime you have a button or a label or anything that has, you know, an intrinsic size like that. It'll also, if there's some nearby thing it could do, like fix the trailing space to its container, it could do that for you too. But you can control drag to yourself too, which sounds crazy, but you'll get used to doing that. So control drag is way number 3 to set up constraints. Okay? So there is a lot to this system. I've just tried to kind of show you where to look for everything, how to click on things, where to inspect them, where to see the constraints, how to go in the document outline to resolve problems, whether they be red or yellow. It would take me many lectures to cover all the different kinds of constraints that you can set up. And, you know, for example, do you see in the inspector there where it says content hugging priority and content compression resistance priority? That hugging priority, that's not because these views love each other, but sometimes they do. But mostly the hugging priority is because you have sometimes views that are sharing some horizontal or vertical space. And when they share and that space gets removed from them or gets taken away or they get more space added to them, they need to know which of those views wants to keep its size the most and which of them wants to get extra and which is willing to be compressed and which is not willing to be compressed. Thus you have compression resistance priority and content hugging priority. Okay? So that's as much as I'm going to say about those. You've got to read up on those if you're going to do that. You're not going to be building UIs, I don't think, like that in your homework. If you are, more power to you to go look up content hugging and content compression resistances. Okay? The last thing there you see is intrinsic size. Again, a bunch of iOS things have an intrinsic size like labels and buttons, but you could actually have your own custom views. Again, not for your homework. You could have your own custom views that have their own intrinsic size. They just have to implement a little API that reports their intrinsic size, and that little pop-up there lets you tell Xcode how to handle that because it doesn't really know how to handle that for non-system objects like labels and buttons. Okay? So the demo I'm going to do is I'm going to take a tributor, which hopefully you still remember a tributor from 3 lectures ago or whatever it was. And we're going to make a tributor so it auto-rotates and looks good. A tributor is the thing that had the text and we could outline it and pick the colors. Remember that? So we're going to make that do that. We use the guidelines when we built a tributor, so it's going to be really easy to make this work. Okay, but I just want to show you what it all looks like to make it go. And I'll do this slide because we'll finish with the demo. On Friday, I'm still hoping to get this university developer thing going. Again, I'm not going to require any of you to get the thing working on your device until I can get you into this program, so no worries there. And those of you who are doing the $99 program, you're all good to go. Hopefully it's all just working for you. Your homework, as you know, is due on Monday. And next week we're going to do scroll view and table view. Actually, we probably won't do